Welcome to Midnight Affairs, where secrets unravel, desires ignite, and bold stories keep you on the edge. Tonight begins Chapter 1, our very first story where passion meets betrayal in the most gripping way. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next thrilling chapter. As the warm hues of the setting sun bled through the sheer curtains, James sat in his armchair, a steaming cup of coffee untouched on the side table. The room was quiet, too quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. He had always loved this time of day when he and Martha would sit together, reminiscing about their past, laughing about their children's antics, or planning their next small adventure. But tonight she wasn't here. His gaze fell on her phone lying on the kitchen counter. It was unusual for Martha to leave it unattended. The thought struck him as odd. She had been unusually protective of it lately, brushing off his questions with vague answers or an annoyed chuckle. For the past few weeks, small cracks had begun to appear in their otherwise seamless routine. Late-night walks that didn't include him. Whispers over the phone, stifled laughter that wasn't meant for his ears. James sighed, running his hand through his thinning gray hair. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. They had been together for over 30 years through thick and thin. He had never doubted her, not even when their friends went through divorces and infidelities that rocked their social circle. Martha was different. She was loyal, dependable, the kind of woman who would rather fix things than abandon them. And yet, something didn't feel right tonight. The air was heavy, oppressive even, as if the house itself sensed the tension building within him. Curiosity got the better of him. He reached for her phone, his fingers trembling slightly. The screen lit up, revealing a single unread message: "I can't wait to see you again." Tonight was unforgettable. James's breath caught in his throat. The words blurred before his eyes, his heart pounding like a drum. He stared at the message, the familiar comfort of their shared life suddenly slipping away like sand through his fingers. As the shadows deepened around him, James realized his world might not be as unshakable as he had always believed. James and Martha had built a life together that many would envy. They had met in their 20s at a community fundraiser in their small town of Elmsworth. She had been the vibrant, spirited young woman in a yellow sundress who commanded the room with her laughter, and he, the quiet but determined young man who couldn't take his eyes off her. It didn't take long for them to fall in love, and a year later they were married. The first decade of their marriage was a whirlwind of dreams and challenges. They bought their first home, a modest 2-story house with a red front door and a garden Martha adored. It was here they raised their 2 children, Claire and Nathan. The house was filled with the chaos of family life. School projects sprawled on the dining table, the smell of Martha's famous apple pie wafting through the air, and the sound of James's deep laughter as he played board games with the kids on lazy Sunday afternoons. James worked as a financial advisor, a steady job that allowed him to provide for his family but often demanded long hours. Martha, on the other hand, dedicated herself to being a homemaker. She thrived in her role, creating a warm and inviting space for her family. Her love for the little things, folding laundry just right, tending to her roses and organizing family picnics, was the glue that held their family together. The years passed quickly, and soon the children had grown and left home to start lives of their own. Claire, the eldest, married and moved to New York, where she pursued a career in journalism. Nathan, the younger, went abroad to teach English in Japan. Both visited occasionally, but their lives were busy, and the house grew quieter with each passing year. James retired early after decades of working tirelessly. He had spent years looking forward to this chapter of their lives, imagining the trips they'd take and the hobbies they'd explore together. He pictured lazy mornings reading the newspaper with Martha, road trips to the countryside, and maybe even a cruise, something she had always dreamed about. But retirement didn't unfold the way he had envisioned. James found himself drawn to quieter pursuits, reading history books, fixing up small projects in the garage, or watching the news in the evenings. Martha, however, seemed restless. She'd spent her life caring for others, and now, with no children to look after and James content with his solitude, she felt adrift. At first, her newfound energy seemed harmless. She joined a gardening club, started attending yoga classes, and even volunteered at the local library. James admired her for staying active and finding purpose, though he couldn't deny feeling a pang of guilt for not sharing in her enthusiasm. She deserves it, he told himself. After years of sacrifice, Martha had earned the right to focus on herself. But gradually her behavior began to change. She started dressing differently, choosing bold dresses that clung to her figure in ways she hadn't favored in years. Her makeup, once reserved for special occasions, became part of her daily routine. James noticed the lingering scent of her perfume, floral, light, and unmistakable, every time she passed him. "What's the occasion?" he teased one evening as she walked into the living room wearing a sleek red dress. She smiled but didn't quite meet his eyes. "Just felt like dressing up, that's all." James brushed it off, chalking it up to her trying to rediscover herself. Yet, small moments began to add up. Her walks around the neighborhood grew longer, and sometimes she'd return flushed, her cheeks pink and her breath uneven. She began keeping her phone close, something she'd never done before. Once, when it buzzed with a message, he saw her glance at the screen and quickly tuck it away into her pocket. "Who was that?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Just a friend from the library," she replied with a breezy wave of her hand. Her explanations always seemed plausible, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Their evenings, once spent together on the couch watching old movies, had become solitary affairs. Martha claimed to be tired or preoccupied with her volunteer work. Sometimes she would sit on the porch alone, staring out into the dark street, her thoughts seemingly miles away. James began to replay their past in his mind, searching for signs he might have missed. Had he neglected her without realizing it? Had he become so comfortable in their routine that he'd taken her for granted? He wanted to talk to her, to ask her outright if something was wrong, but every time he opened his mouth, the words died on his lips. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. James finally mustered the courage to speak. "Martha," he said, his voice soft but firm, "is everything okay? You've seemed different lately." She looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. "Of course everything's fine," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Why would you think otherwise?" "I don't know," James said, choosing his words carefully. "You've been distant. Is there something you're not telling me?" Martha sighed, setting down her fork. "James, not everything has to mean something. I'm just trying to figure out who I am now that the kids are gone, that's all. Can't I have some space to do that?" Her tone was calm, but her words felt like a wall being built between them. James nodded, not wanting to push her further. But as the days turned into weeks, the feeling of unease grew stronger. He began noticing small, almost imperceptible changes. The way she hurriedly ended phone calls when he walked into the room, the faint scent of cologne that wasn't his on her scarf, the late-night text notifications that made her phone light up on the nightstand. James told himself he was being paranoid. They had been married for over 3 decades. She had stood by him through everything. His long hours at work, his health scares, even the moments when he wasn't the husband he should have been. Martha wasn't the type to stray. And yet, the doubt lingered. Behind their familiar smiles, there were cracks they didn't dare to acknowledge. James and Martha had spent over 3 decades together, building a life filled with shared milestones and countless memories. But now, for the first time, James felt the foundation of their relationship shifting beneath his feet. Martha's relationship with Richard hadn't started with an affair in mind. At least that's what she told herself. He was just a man who happened to cross her path at the right, or wrong, time. Richard was new to Elmsworth, having moved to the small town after retiring from a long career as a literature professor in the city. Widowed for 10 years, he carried himself with a quiet dignity and an easy charm that made people gravitate toward him. Their first interaction was innocent. Martha had been shelving books in the back of the library when she heard a loud thud followed by a muffled groan. She turned to find Richard struggling to lift a heavy box of donated books. "Let me help you with that," she said, hurrying over. "Are you sure?" "I'd hate to throw my back out in yours," Richard replied with a chuckle. Martha smiled. "I think I can handle it." That simple exchange turned into a warm friendship. Richard was kind, attentive, and a great listener, qualities Martha hadn't realized she craved until they were right in front of her. Over time their conversations deepened. During library breaks they sat on a wooden bench outside, sipping coffee and sharing stories about their lives. Richard often spoke of his late wife, Margaret, and the life they had built together. He had a way of reminiscing that was both tender and melancholic, his voice soft with memories but edged with loneliness. Martha found herself drawn to his vulnerability. For Martha, it was a rare opportunity to talk about herself. At home, James had grown quiet in recent years, content to spend his days immersed in his books or tinkering with projects in the garage. They still shared meals and exchanged pleasantries, but the spark of their earlier years had dimmed. Conversations felt more like habits than meaningful exchanges. Richard, on the other hand, asked questions that made Martha feel seen. "What's something you've always wanted to do but never had the chance?" he asked one afternoon, his eyes fixed on her with genuine curiosity. Martha hesitated, surprised by the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I never thought about it. Life just happened." Richard smiled gently. "It's never too late, you know. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us that we're still allowed to dream." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended. That night, as she lay beside James in their bed, staring at the ceiling, she wondered when she had stopped dreaming. Their friendship began to evolve in ways Martha couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. She started looking forward to her time at the library, dressing a little more carefully and adding a spritz of perfume she hadn't worn in years. Richard noticed. "You look lovely today," he said one morning as they organized a shelf of biographies. Martha blushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Their moments together became more intimate, though still justifiable in Martha's mind. When Richard's hand lingered on hers for a moment too long, she told herself it was just a friendly gesture. When he complimented her laugh or the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her children, she convinced herself it was harmless. But deep down she knew the lines were blurring. One evening, Richard invited her to join him for coffee outside of their usual library setting. He suggested a small cafe on the edge of town, tucked away from prying eyes. Martha hesitated but ultimately agreed, convincing herself it was nothing more than a friendly gesture. The cafe was cozy and dimly lit, with soft jazz playing in the background. As they sat across from each other, sipping their drinks, Richard leaned forward. "Martha, I need to be honest with you," he said, his voice low and serious. She felt her heart race, both with anticipation and fear. "What is it?" "I don't want to complicate your life," he began. "But I can't deny how much I enjoy spending time with you. You've brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever." Martha's breath caught. She looked down at her coffee cup, her thoughts swirling. "Richard, she began, but the words wouldn't come. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know how I feel." That night, as she drove home, Martha felt a storm of emotions, flattered, conflicted, guilty, and exhilarated all at once. She told herself she needed to pull back, to put some distance between herself and Richard, but the pull of his attention was too strong. At home, James noticed the change. Martha's once predictable routines now felt erratic. She was spending more time at the library, taking longer walks in the evenings, and seemed distracted even when they were together. One night, as they sat in the living room watching TV, James glanced over at her. She was scrolling through her phone, a small smile playing on her lips. "What's so funny?" he asked casually. Martha looked up, startled. "Oh, nothing. Just something from the library group chat," she said quickly, locking her phone and setting it aside. James didn't press her, but the uneasy feeling in his chest grew. The turning point came when James noticed something out of place. Martha's scarf, which she always kept neatly folded in the closet, was draped carelessly over the back of a chair. As he picked it up, a faint scent of cologne wafted up, one that wasn't his. He stared at the scarf, his mind racing. Could it be innocent? Maybe she had hugged a friend or brushed past someone at the library. But the doubts that had been simmering for weeks now boiled over. James confronted Martha that evening. "Martha," he began, his voice steady but tense, "I need to ask you something." She turned to him, her expression wary. "What is it?" "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked, holding up the scarf. "This smells like cologne. And it's not mine." Martha's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. Then she straightened her shoulders. "James, you're being ridiculous," she said, her tone defensive. "I probably brushed against someone at the library." But James wasn't convinced. "Martha, I know something's going on. You've been different lately. Distant. If there's something I should know, just tell me." Her expression softened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving James alone with his doubts. What started as a harmless exchange was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous. James had always prided himself on being observant. In his years as a financial advisor, noticing the smallest discrepancies had been his greatest asset. But now, as he watched Martha move about the house, it felt as though he were piecing together a puzzle where the key pieces had gone missing. It started with the scarf. The faint trace of cologne had set off alarm bells in his mind. He had tried to dismiss it, telling himself that it was nothing more than an innocent coincidence. But the scarf was just the beginning. One morning, while Martha was out on one of her increasingly frequent walks, James decided to tidy up the living room. As he lifted the cushions on the sofa to fluff them, he found a small jewelry box wedged into the corner. Frowning, he pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, its clasp adorned with a small heart-shaped charm. James's heart sank. He hadn't bought her a bracelet in years. When Martha returned later, her cheeks flushed from the crisp autumn air, James held up the box. "What's this?" Martha froze for a moment, her eyes darting from the bracelet to James's face. "Oh, that," she said with a nervous laugh. "It's just something I picked up for myself. I thought it was pretty." James studied her carefully. "You've never bought yourself jewelry before. Why now?" Martha shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I guess I just felt like treating myself." "Is that a crime?" Her words were light, but her tone was defensive. James let it go, though the unease in his chest only grew. Over the next few weeks, the inconsistencies piled up. Martha's phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter or bedside table, was now always with her, tucked into her pocket or her purse. When it buzzed, she would glance at the screen and quickly lock it, a small, secretive smile playing on her lips. James began paying closer attention to her comings and goings. She claimed to be spending more time at the library, but her explanations felt rehearsed, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place, guilt, perhaps, or fear. One evening, James decided to follow her. She had said she was meeting the library group for dinner, but something about her tone had seemed off. As she left the house, dressed in a bold green dress that hugged her figure in a way James hadn't seen in years, he waited a few minutes before grabbing his coat and heading out. He kept a safe distance as he followed her car through the quiet streets of Elmsworth. When she pulled into the parking lot of a small Italian restaurant, James parked across the street and watched as she got out of the car. To his shock, Richard was waiting for her near the entrance. The older man's face lit up as Martha approached, and he leaned in to kiss her cheek, a gesture that felt far too familiar for James's liking. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. He had suspected something was going on, but seeing it with his own eyes was a blow he wasn't prepared for. Martha and Richard entered the restaurant together, their laughter drifting back to James as they disappeared inside. For a moment, he considered storming in after them, demanding an explanation. But a part of him held back, paralyzed by the fear of what he might uncover. Instead, he drove home, his thoughts swirling. When Martha returned later that evening, she was unusually cheerful, her smile wide and her laughter ringing through the house. "How was dinner?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Oh, it was lovely," Martha replied, her tone light. "We had such a good time discussing the upcoming library fundraiser." James nodded, his stomach churning. He didn't confront her that night, but his doubts gnawed at him like a persistent ache. The following day, James decided to dig deeper. While Martha was out, he went into her study, a small room she had claimed as her own after the kids moved out. As he opened the drawers, he felt a pang of guilt, but his need for answers outweighed his conscience. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old notebooks, he found a folded piece of paper. Opening it, he saw a handwritten note. "Thank you for making me feel alive again. Can't wait to see you soon. Richard." James's hand shook as he held the note. The words blurred before his eyes, his mind reeling. It wasn't just his imagination. Martha was hiding something and Richard was at the center of it. That evening, James decided to confront her. As they sat down to dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. "Martha," he began, his voice tight, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her plate, her expression wary. "What is it? Are you seeing someone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. Martha's fork clattered onto her plate. "James, how can you even ask me that?" she said, her voice trembling. "I found this," James said, pulling out the note and placing it on the table. "Care to explain?" Martha stared at the note, her face pale. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Then she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Then what is it?" James demanded, his voice rising. "Because it looks like my wife of 30 years has been sneaking around with another man." Tears welled in Martha's eyes. "James, I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. I didn't plan this." Her words hit James like a punch to the gut. He pushed back his chair and stood, his hands clenched into fists. "Then explain it to me, Martha," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Explain how we got here." With every unanswered question, his doubts grew stronger, and so did the cracks in their fragile peace. James stared at Martha, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. Her confession wasn't explicit, but it was enough to confirm what he had dreaded. 30 years of marriage, 3 decades of love, trust, and companionship, now felt like a house of cards collapsing with one gust of wind. Martha looked away, her hands trembling as she clutched the napkin on her lap. "It's complicated, James," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Complicated?" James repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Do you think you owe me more than that after 30 years of marriage?" Martha sighed, the weight of her guilt visible on her face. "It's not what you think. I never wanted to hurt you." James slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the quiet dining room. "Then why, Martha? Why him? Why now?" Martha flinched but didn't answer immediately. She fiddled with her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger as if trying to summon the courage to speak. "I didn't go looking for this," she began, her voice quivering. "It just happened. I felt invisible, James. For years I felt like I'm just here existing but not really living." James stared at her, his brow furrowing. "Invisible? Martha, I've been here every day. I've never turned my back on you. But you haven't seen me either," she shot back, her voice breaking. "You've been content to sit in your chair with your books, your routines, while I've been yearning for something more. Richard, he made me feel alive again." Hearing Richard's name made James's blood boil. "Richard," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "What does he have that I don't? Is it the way he flatters you? Or is it just the thrill of sneaking around behind my back?" Tears streamed down Martha's face as she shook her head. "It's not about him, James. It's about me. I spent my whole life taking care of everyone else. Our kids, you, this house. And now that they're gone, I don't know who I am anymore." James clenched his jaw, his mind reeling. Her words cut deep, and though he wanted to lash out, a part of him recognized the truth in what she was saying. "Do you even love me anymore?" he asked, his voice cracking. Martha's silence was deafening. James stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, staring out into the dark night. "I gave you everything, Martha. My time, my loyalty, my love. And you repay me by sneaking around with someone else?" "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Martha said, her voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to betray you. I needed to feel something again." James turned to face her, his eyes filled with pain. "You think I don't understand that? You think I haven't felt the same emptiness? But I didn't look elsewhere, Martha. I stayed. I fought for us." Martha buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how we got here." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Martha's weeping. James felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, heartbreak, but underneath it all was a deep, aching sadness. The following days were a blur of tension and avoidance. James couldn't look at Martha without feeling the sting of her betrayal, and Martha seemed lost in her own guilt. They barely spoke, their once lively home now filled with an oppressive silence. James couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Richard's face, the image of him and Martha together playing on a loop in his mind. He thought about their children, Claire and Nathan, and wondered how they would react if they knew. Would they blame him for not being enough? Would they turn on Martha for her betrayal? One evening, James sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed on the coffee table and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Nathan. "Hey Dad, just checking in. How's everything?" James stared at the message, his throat tightening. He wanted to reply, to pretend that everything was fine, but the weight of his emotions made it impossible. Martha entered the room quietly, her eyes red from crying. "James," she began, her voice hesitant. "What is it, Martha?" he asked, his tone weary. "I want to fix this," she said, her hands clasped in front of her. I know I've hurt you and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I don't want to throw away everything we've built. Please let's talk. James set down his glass and looked at her, his expression unreadable. Talk? What's there to talk about? You made your choice, Martha. You let someone else into our marriage. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice trembling. It happened so slowly I didn't even realize where it was heading until it was too late. James shook his head, his anger bubbling to the surface. Don't insult me by pretending this was an accident. You knew what you were doing every step of the way. Martha's tears flowed freely now. I love you, James. I never stopped loving you. Please, can't we try to rebuild what we had? James stood, his hands clenched into fists. You want to rebuild? How do I rebuild trust when you've shattered it? How do I look at you and not see his face? Tell me, Martha, how do I move past this? Her silence was his answer. In a single moment, the life he thought he knew was turned upside down. The silence in the house grew heavier with each passing day. James and Martha moved through their shared space like strangers, their conversations reduced to brief, functional exchanges. Even the sound of their footsteps on the wooden floors seemed louder, each echo a reminder of the emptiness between them. James found himself haunted by questions he couldn't answer. How had he missed the signs? Was it his fault? Could he have done more to make her feel valued, loved? These thoughts consumed him during sleepless nights and aimless walks through the town. Martha, on the other hand, seemed trapped in her own bubble of guilt and confusion. She tried to continue her routines, watering the garden, folding laundry, but everything felt hollow. Every time she caught James's eyes, she saw the pain she had inflicted and felt the sharp sting of regret. The tension came to a head one evening when Claire called unexpectedly. Hi, Dad, Claire said brightly. Just wanted to check in. How are you and Mom doing? James hesitated, the phone pressed to his ear. We're fine, he lied, his voice flat. Are you sure? Claire asked, her tone turning cautious. You sound off. Martha, sitting across the room, watched him nervously. She knew Claire could sense something was wrong. She always had a knack for reading between the lines. James glanced at Martha, his jaw tightening. Everything's fine, he repeated, forcing a smile she couldn't see. But Claire wasn't convinced. Okay, she said slowly. Well, if you need anything, you know I'm here. After hanging up, James stared at the phone in his hand. He felt the weight of the secret pressing down on him, threatening to suffocate him. Claire's worried, he said finally, breaking the silence. Martha looked down at her hands, her voice barely audible. What did you tell her? I told her everything's fine, James said bitterly. But we both know that's a lie. Martha opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Later that night, James found himself in the garage, staring at the half-finished birdhouse he had been working on before everything unraveled. The sight of it filled him with anger. He grabbed it and hurled it across the room, the wood splintering against the wall. 30 years, he muttered to himself, his voice shaking. 30 years and this is how it ends? The next day, James decided he couldn't live in the dark anymore. He needed answers no matter how painful they might be. While Martha was out, he logged onto her email, something he had never done before. Guilt gnawed at him as he clicked through her messages, but his need for the truth outweighed his conscience. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. There, in her inbox, was a thread of emails between her and Richard. The messages were subtle, carefully worded, but the intimacy was unmistakable. I can't stop thinking about our last conversation. You always know exactly what to say to make me smile. I wish we had more time. Being with you feels like the first time I've truly been seen. James stared at the screen, his hands trembling. His worst fears were confirmed. It wasn't just emotional, it was deeply personal. When Martha returned home that afternoon, James was waiting for her in the living room, the laptop open on the coffee table. What's this? He demanded, pointing to the screen. Martha froze, her face paling as she realized what he had found. James? Don't, he said sharply, his voice rising. Don't try to explain it away. Just tell me the truth. Tears filled her eyes as she sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I never meant for you to find out like this, she said quietly. Do you think that makes it better? James shouted, standing over her. Do you think it hurts any less knowing that you tried to hide it from me? I didn't know how to stop, Martha admitted, her voice trembling. Richard, he made me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. But it was wrong, James. I know it was wrong. Alive? James repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And what about me, Martha? What about our life, our family? Was that not enough for you? Martha buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I don't know who I am anymore, she said through her tears. I've spent my whole life being a wife and a mother. And now that the kids are gone, I feel lost. James's anger gave way to a deep, aching sadness. He sat down across from her, his head in his hands. You should have told me, he said, his voice hoarse. We could have figured it out together. But now, I don't know if we can ever come back from this. The days that followed were a mix of confrontation and avoidance. James couldn't bring himself to sleep in the same bed as Martha, so he moved to the guest room. They continued their routines, but every interaction was strained, every word laced with unspoken pain. The revelation also had ripple effects beyond their home. James couldn't hide his turmoil when Claire and Nathan called, and soon they began to suspect something was wrong. Dad, is everything okay with you and Mom? Nathan asked during one of their video calls. James hesitated, his throat tightening. He glanced at Martha, who was sitting nearby, her eyes filled with guilt. We're working through some things, James said finally, his voice heavy. Nathan frowned. If you need to talk, I'm here. You both are. James nodded, forcing a weak smile. Thanks, son. After the call ended, James turned to Martha. How do we tell them? Martha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't want them to hate me, she whispered. James sighed, his heart aching. They deserve to know the truth, Martha. They're a part of this too. The weight of their choices was heavier than they had ever imagined. James's patience had worn thin. Days of unanswered questions and Martha's evasiveness had pushed him to his limit. The truth of her affair with Richard weighed heavily on him, a festering wound that refused to heal. But he needed more than guilt and vague confessions. He needed closure, and that meant confronting the man who had stolen his wife's attention. James found himself driving across town one evening, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He had seen Richard's car parked at the library earlier, a place that now felt tainted by betrayal. Martha hadn't mentioned going there that day, which only confirmed James's suspicions. When he arrived, the library was closed, but the lights in the back office were still on. James parked a short distance away and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't long before he saw them, Martha and Richard, walking out together. They were laughing softly, their body language intimate. Richard reached out, placing a hand on Martha's arm, and James saw red. He stepped out of his car and marched toward them, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. Martha, he called out, his voice sharp and cutting through the night. Martha froze, her face draining of color as she turned to see him. Richard's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort, and he instinctively stepped back. James, Martha began, her voice trembling, what are you doing here? What am I doing here? James echoed, his voice rising. That's the question, isn't it? The real question is, what are you doing here, with him? Richard raised his hands, his tone calm but cautious. James, I think we should talk about this. Don't you dare. James snapped, his eyes narrowing. You don't get to talk. You've already said enough, haven't you? Whispering in my wife's ear, making her feel alive. Isn't that what she said? James, please, Martha pleaded, stepping between them. Let's go home and talk about this. No, Martha. We're not sweeping this under the rug. Not this time, James said, his voice shaking with anger. He turned his attention back to Richard. How long has this been going on? How long have you been meeting behind my back? Richard sighed, his face etched with regret. James, I never meant to hurt you. Don't give me that, James barked. You didn't think twice about what this would do to me, to my family? Martha reached for James's arm, but he pulled away, his eyes blazing. You lied to me, Martha. For weeks you've been sneaking around, making excuses, and now this? How could you? Martha's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to happen, James. I never wanted to hurt you. James let out a bitter laugh. But you did. And now here we are. Richard stepped forward, his tone steady but firm. James, I think you need to hear her out. This isn't as black and white as it seems. James's head snapped toward him, his fists clenching. Don't you dare tell me what I need to do. You don't get a say in this. You've already crossed every line. For a moment, the tension was unbearable. The three of them stood there, the weight of their choices pressing down on them like an unbearable force. Finally, Martha broke the silence. "James, I love you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never stopped loving you. But I lost myself along the way and I didn't know how to find my way back." James stared at her, his emotions warring within him. Anger, heartbreak, betrayal, all of it threatened to consume him. "You could have come to me, Martha. We could have faced this together. But you chose him." Martha wiped her tears, her voice desperate. "I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you. But please, James, don't let this be the end of us." Richard took a step back, sensing that his presence was only making things worse. "I'll leave you two to talk," he said quietly, his gaze lingering on Martha for a moment before he turned and walked away. James watched him go, his fists still clenched at his sides. When he was out of sight, he turned to Martha, his voice heavy with emotion. "Is this what it's come to? 30 years, and now I have to compete with a stranger for your attention?" Martha shook her head, her tears falling freely. "No, James. There's no competition. There never was. I lost sight of what mattered most. And that's you." James looked away, his chest heaving with the weight of her words. For a long moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Martha. I don't know if I'll ever trust you again." Martha stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. Just tell me what to do, James. Please." James closed his eyes, his heart breaking all over again. "I don't have the answers right now. But I need time. Time to figure out if we can salvage what's left." Martha nodded, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I'll wait, James. However long it takes." The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. In the weeks that followed their confrontation, James and Martha lived in a tense limbo. The once warm and inviting home they had built together now felt like a cold battleground where every conversation was a reminder of the fracture between them. James spent his days lost in thought, often retreating to his garage, while Martha tried to keep herself busy with housework, her every action tinged with a desperate hope for redemption. One quiet morning, James sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the barren garden. The roses Martha had once tended with so much care had withered, much like their relationship. His thoughts were interrupted when Martha entered the room, her steps hesitant. She held a letter in her hand. "I wrote this for you," she said, placing the envelope on the table. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "I know I've said so much already, but I needed to put it all into words." James looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "You could have said those words to me months ago, Martha," he said bitterly. Martha's face crumpled, and she left the room without another word. James stared at the envelope for a long time before finally picking it up and opening it. The letter was raw, filled with apologies and confessions. Martha wrote about her loneliness, her struggles with identity after the children moved away, and the way Richard had filled a void she hadn't even realized was there. But more than that, she wrote about her regret, how she would give anything to take back her actions, to erase the hurt she had caused. By the time James finished reading, his hands were trembling. He felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and an unfamiliar glimmer of understanding. He didn't forgive her, not yet, but for the first time he began to see her not just as the woman who had betrayed him, but as a person grappling with her own flaws and insecurities. That evening they sat down in the living room, the silence between them heavy. "I read your letter," James said finally. Martha looked up, her eyes red from crying. "And?" James sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'm still angry, Martha. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry. But I can't pretend that I didn't play a part in this. I let us drift apart, and I didn't see how much you were hurting." Martha wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "You didn't deserve this, James. You've always been a good man. I let my own fears and selfishness blind me to that." They talked late into the night, their conversation raw and honest. For the first time in years, they didn't shy away from the difficult truths. They spoke about the cracks that had formed in their relationship long before Richard entered the picture. James's retreat into his routines, Martha's unspoken feelings of being taken for granted. But words alone couldn't heal the wounds. The following days were filled with small, tentative steps toward rebuilding. James moved back into their bedroom, though the distance between them and the bed was palpable. Martha stopped going to the library, choosing instead to focus on rekindling their bond. One afternoon, James received a call from Claire. "Dad, what's going on with you and Mom?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. James hesitated before answering. "We're working through some things," he said carefully. Claire was silent for a moment. "I hope you can. You and Mom have always been my example of what love looks like. I'd hate to see that change." Her words lingered with James long after the call ended. He realized that their marriage wasn't just about the two of them, it was the foundation of their family, the legacy they had built together. James decided to confront Richard one last time. He needed closure not for Martha but for himself. He found Richard at the park, sitting on a bench with a book in his hands. "Richard," James said, his voice steady. Richard looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. "James? I'm not here to fight," James began. "I just need to know, why her? Why my wife?" Richard set the book aside, his gaze serious. "Because she's remarkable," he said simply. "She's kind, intelligent, and stronger than she gives herself credit for. I never meant to hurt you, James. I didn't plan for any of this to happen." James nodded, his jaw tight. "I don't need your apologies. I just needed to hear it from you." He turned to leave, but Richard called after him. "For what it's worth, James, I hope you two can find your way back to each other. She loves you. She always has." James didn't respond, but Richard's words stayed with him. Over time, James and Martha began to rebuild their relationship, brick by painful brick. They attended counseling where they learned to communicate in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't easy, there were days when the anger and mistrust threatened to overwhelm them, but they kept going, driven by the hope that their love was worth saving. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Martha reached for James's hand. "Do you think we'll ever get back to the way we were?" she asked softly. James squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe that's not the goal. Maybe it's about finding something new, something stronger." Martha smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'd like that. What would you do if the trust you built over decades was shattered in one moment? Could you forgive, or is some trust too fragile to rebuild?" As the dust settled, the lessons of their choices lingered longer than the pain. Flashback. As James and Martha worked through their fractured relationship, a storm brewed beneath the surface, one neither of them was ready to face. Late one night, while Martha lay asleep, James sat at the edge of the bed, a sleepless haze clouding his thoughts. The memories of their youth, of the life they had built, seemed distant, almost unreal. But now there was something else gnawing at him, something unspoken. He picked up his phone and stared at an old photograph of Martha from years ago. She was laughing, holding a bouquet of wildflowers James had picked for her during one of their rare weekend getaways. He had loved that smile, the way her eyes lit up. But now he couldn't help but wonder, had he lost her long before Richard ever entered the picture? The next day, while Martha was out running errands, James found himself unable to resist opening the drawer in her study. He had avoided it since their confrontation, wanting to respect her privacy, but an itch inside him refused to go away. He sifted through papers, her journals, and old photographs, hoping, fearing, to find something that would finally answer the questions haunting him. Among the neatly stacked files, he found an old leather-bound journal. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age. James hesitated, his fingers brushing over the cover before opening it to the first page. The journal dated back nearly 15 years. As he skimmed through the entries, his chest tightened. The words were raw and emotional, revealing a side of Martha he hadn't seen before. "James has been working late again. I know he's doing it for us, for the kids, but I feel invisible. It's like I'm not even here anymore." James's throat tightened as he read on. The entries painted a picture of a woman desperate for connection, someone who felt lost in her role as a wife and mother. Then a later entry caught his attention. "I ran into Peter today. It's been years, but seeing him brought back so many memories. We talked for hours and it felt like no time had passed. I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. He reminds me of the person I used to be." James froze. Peter. The name was unfamiliar, but the tone of the entry was unmistakable. He flipped through more pages, piecing together a story he hadn't known existed. Peter was an old flame from Martha's youth, someone she had reconnected with briefly while James was immersed in work. The entries hinted at long conversations, stolen glances, and a kiss, one Martha had written about with both guilt and longing. It was just one moment, one mistake. But I can't stop thinking about it. James can never know. James closed the journal, his hands trembling. This wasn't just about Richard. This wasn't the first time Martha had felt disconnected enough to seek something, or someone, outside their marriage. When Martha returned home later that evening, James confronted her. "Who was Peter?" he asked, his voice calm but steely. Martha froze in the doorway, the grocery bags in her hands slipping to the floor. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Martha," James said, holding up the journal. "I found this. I read it. All of it." Martha's face crumpled and she sank into a chair. "That was years ago, James," she whispered. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." "Didn't think it mattered?" James said, his voice rising. "It matters to me. How many more secrets are you hiding? How many times have you felt the need to look elsewhere?" "It wasn't like that," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. He was a mistake. I was lonely and you were so focused on work. I felt like I didn't exist to you anymore." James shook his head, pacing the room. "So, instead of talking to me, you turned to someone else? And then you buried it, pretending it never happened." "I didn't want to hurt you," Martha said, her voice breaking. "It was one moment, James. It never went further than that. But now it's Richard," James snapped. "Don't you see the pattern here, Martha? Whenever things get hard, you find someone else to fill the gaps." Martha flinched as if he had struck her. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't hated myself for it?" The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. After a long pause, Martha spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you, James. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I've always loved you. Even when I felt lost, even when I didn't know how to fix us, I loved you." James stared at her, his emotions warring within him. He wanted to yell, to lash out, but more than anything he wanted to understand. "Why didn't you tell me about Peter? Why didn't you come to me when you were feeling like this?" "I was ashamed," Martha admitted. "I didn't know how to tell you that I felt like I was disappearing. And I didn't want to risk losing you." James sat down across from her, his head in his hands. "You don't get to make that choice for me, Martha. If we're going to have any chance at saving this, I need to know everything. No more secrets." Martha nodded, her tears falling freely. "No more secrets," she promised. Over the next few weeks, the revelations about Peter hung over them like a dark cloud. It was another layer of betrayal for James to process, another hurdle for them to overcome. But it also forced them to confront the deeper issues in their marriage, the unspoken resentments, the missed opportunities for connection. They began to rebuild not just their trust but their understanding of each other. Martha opened up about her struggles, her fears of losing her identity, and James shared his own regrets about not being more present. The past has a way of revealing truths we tried to bury. Would you be able to face the hidden truths in your relationship, or are some secrets better left undiscovered? The past had left its mark, but it was in facing those buried truths that they began to find a path forward. The silence of their home was broken one evening by an unexpected knock at the door. James, sitting in the living room with a book he hadn't managed to focus on for days, frowned and stood to answer it. The sight that greeted him on the other side was both surprising and unsettling. Standing on the porch was Claire, their eldest daughter, her coat dusted with snow and her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Claire?" James said, stepping aside to let her in. "What are you doing here? You didn't say you were coming." "I didn't want to call," she replied, her voice firm but laced with emotion. "Something told me you'd just say everything was fine when it clearly isn't." James hesitated, his mind racing. He had tried to shield the children from the mess unfolding between him and Martha, but Claire's arrival made it clear she had sensed the cracks from afar. "Where's Mom?" Claire asked, looking around. "In the kitchen," James said quietly, gesturing toward the back of the house. Claire nodded and made her way to the kitchen, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. James followed, unsure of what would happen next. Martha looked up from the counter where she was chopping vegetables. Her eyes widened when she saw Claire. "Claire," she said, setting down the knife. "What are you doing here?" "I came because I'm worried about you too," Claire said bluntly, crossing her arms. "And judging by the tension in this house, I was right to be." Martha exchanged a glance with James, her shoulders slumping. "We didn't want to involve you," she said softly. "Well, it's a little late for that," Claire shot back. "Dad barely talks on the phone anymore, and when he does, he sounds miserable. And you? You've been avoiding my calls, Mom. What's going on? James sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated, Claire. Claire narrowed her eyes. Then uncomplicated. I'm not a kid anymore. Whatever this is, I can handle it. Martha sat down at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Your father and I, we've been going through a rough patch, she began, her voice trembling. Rough patch. Claire repeated, her tone sharp. That's putting it lightly, isn't it? James stepped forward, his voice firm. Claire, this isn't something you need to get involved in. It's between your mother and me. Claire shook her head. No, Dad. It's not just between you two. Whatever happens affects all of us. Me, Nathan, even the grandkids someday. You can't just shut me out and pretend everything's fine. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, James spoke. Your mother? He paused, struggling to find the right words. She made some choices that hurt me. Hurt us? Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. Claire frowned, her gaze shifting between her parents. Choices? What kind of choices? James hesitated, but Martha spoke up. I had an emotional affair, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire's eyes widened, and she took a step back as if the words had physically struck her. An affair? She repeated, her voice shaking. With who? Someone from the library, Martha said, her tears spilling over. It's over now, but it's caused so much damage. Claire looked at her father, her face a mixture of shock and betrayal. And you knew about this? James nodded, his jaw tight. I found out weeks ago. Claire turned back to Martha, her expression hardening. How could you? After everything Dad's done for you, for us? How could you throw it all away? I didn't mean to, Martha said, her voice cracking. I made a terrible mistake, Claire. And I'm doing everything I can to make it right. Claire shook her head, her emotions boiling over. A mistake? That's all this is to you? A mistake? Claire, James said gently, stepping forward. Your mother knows what she did was wrong. She's trying to fix things. But this is something we have to work through together. Claire's gaze softened as she looked at her father. And you're okay with that? You're just going to forgive her? I didn't say that, James replied. But I'm trying to understand. It's not easy, Claire. Marriage isn't easy. And sometimes people make mistakes that hurt the ones they love. Claire sat down heavily in a chair, her face buried in her hands. I just don't understand. You two were always the example. The couple everyone looked up to. How did it get this bad? James sighed, sitting across from her. Life isn't always what it seems, Claire. Your mother and I, we let things slip through the cracks. And now we're paying the price. Martha reached for Claire's hand, her voice pleading. I know I've let you down. But I love your father and I love you and Nathan. I don't want this to tear our family apart. Claire looked at her mother, her expression conflicted. I want to believe you, Mom. I really do. But it's going to take time. Martha nodded, her tears falling freely. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. All of your trust. Over the next few days, Claire stayed with them, becoming an unexpected bridge between her parents. She encouraged them to talk, to confront their feelings instead of burying them. Her presence brought a new energy to the house, a reminder of the family they had built together. But Claire's arrival wasn't without its own challenges. One evening, as James and Claire sat in the living room, she brought up a subject he hadn't expected. Dad, she began hesitantly, do you think you ever pushed Mom away without realizing it? James frowned, her words hitting a nerve. What are you trying to say, Claire? I'm not excusing what she did, Claire said quickly. But I've been thinking. You've always been so steady, so reliable. Maybe Mom felt like she couldn't reach you emotionally, like you didn't need her the way she needed you. James leaned back in his chair, her words stirring something deep within him. I thought I was giving her stability, he said quietly. I thought that was enough. Maybe it was for a while, Claire replied. But people change, Dad. Needs change. James nodded slowly, her words sinking in. Maybe you're right. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, or does it? What would you do if the people you loved most were the ones to challenge your beliefs and force you to see the truth? Claire's presence was a reminder of what was at stake, a family built on years of love, now teetering on the edge of destruction. The days following Claire's visit were quieter but emotionally charged. Her presence had forced James and Martha to confront truths they had been avoiding, Yet the tension between them remained. Each of them carried a different weight. James, the betrayal he felt. Martha, the guilt and shame she couldn't escape. James often found himself sitting alone in the garage, staring at the half-finished projects that had once brought him solace. He held a hammer in his hands, its weight grounding him as his thoughts raced. This place had always been his retreat, a space where he could escape the demands of the world. But now it felt hollow. He thought about Claire's words. Maybe Mom felt like she couldn't reach you emotionally. Was it true? Had he unknowingly pushed Martha away? He had always believed that providing stability, working hard, and being reliable were enough. But perhaps he had overlooked the quieter needs, the emotional connection that Martha had sought elsewhere. One evening, after hours of brooding, James returned to the house. Martha was sitting at the dining table, her journal open in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes tired but hopeful. "James," she said softly, "can we talk?" He nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking a lot," Martha began, her voice trembling. "About us. About how we got here." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. "And what have you figured out?" Martha hesitated, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I think I've spent so much time being what I thought everyone else needed me to be that I forgot who I was. And when I looked at you, I felt like you didn't see me anymore either." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I'm not saying that to excuse what I did," Martha continued quickly. "What I did was wrong, unforgivable even. But I need you to understand that it wasn't about you. It was about me. I was searching for something I thought I'd lost, something I didn't know how to ask you for." James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Martha, I've been trying to wrap my head around this for weeks. I've replayed every moment, every conversation, wondering where I went wrong. And the truth is, I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you without thinking about him." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I know. And if you decide you can't stay, I'll understand. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." James looked at her, his heart heavy. "Do you think we can ever go back to the way things were?" Martha shook her head, her tears spilling over. "No. But maybe we can find a new way forward. If you're willing to try." That night, as James lay awake in bed, he thought about the life they had built together. 30 years of marriage, 2 children, countless memories. He thought about the vacations they had taken, the late-night talks on the porch, the way Martha's laughter had once been the soundtrack of his life. But he also thought about the cracks that had formed over the years, the moments when they had drifted apart without realizing it. He thought about the secrets Martha had kept, the pain they had caused, and the trust that had been broken. James knew that staying would mean choosing to rebuild from the ground up, with no guarantee that they could ever recover what they had lost. But leaving would mean walking away from decades of love, from a family that had weathered storms before. The next morning, James found himself at the park where he often went to clear his mind. He sat on a bench overlooking the pond, the early morning light reflecting off the water. He pulled out his phone and called Nathan. "Dad?" Nathan's voice was groggy, still heavy with sleep. "Hey son," James said. "I know it's early. I just needed to talk." Nathan yawned but didn't complain. "What's going on?" James hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm at a crossroads, Nathan. Your mother and we've been through a lot lately. And I don't know if we can come back from it." Nathan was silent for a moment before speaking. "Dad, I don't know the details, but I do know this. You and Mom have always been the strongest people I know. Whatever decision you make, I trust that it'll be the right one for both of you." James felt a lump in his throat. "Thanks, Nathan. That means a lot." After hanging up, James sat in silence, watching the ducks glide across the water. He thought about his legacy, the family he and Martha had built, the values they had tried to instill in their children. He knew that whatever choice he made would affect more than just the two of them. That evening, James and Martha sat down together at the dining table. "I've made a decision," James said, his voice steady. Martha looked at him, her heart in her throat. "And?" James took a deep breath. "I'm willing to try. But I need to be clear about something. This isn't going to be easy. And it's going to take a long time before I can trust you again." Martha nodded, her tears falling freely. "I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes to earn that trust back." James reached across the table and took her hand. We've been through too much to give up now. But we both need to change. We can't go back to the way things were. We need to build something new. Martha squeezed his hand, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I'm ready, James. Whatever it takes. If you were in their shoes, could you live with the decisions they made? Would you choose to rebuild or walk away knowing the weight of the history you shared? Every choice comes with a price, but some prices are too heavy to pay. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe.